So Panahipi, everyone, I just like to say Pilahuk Wado for joining us. I see that we have a very broad range of relatives that are calling in today or either chiming in, and I just want to welcome you to be a part of this conversation. I like to acknowledge the traditional territories in which I work and learn, which is that of the Muckleshoot, the Puyallup, and the Coast Salish peoples. I want to honor you and your ancestors for bringing your breath and your life to the space, as we know that when we come together as Indigenous peoples, sharing knowledge is about acknowledging it at ceremony. Our knowledges are our elders, and so therefore we would like to respect that in that way. And I noticed that we have an elder if there's an elder who's from the Salish coastal area who would like to open us up in a good way to acknowledge the territories in which I'm from, please raise your hand to do so if you like. I was hoping that Ms. Shelley Vindiola would be available. I don't see her online yet. So would just like to go ahead and if we could just take a moment. I think this is really important as we're navigating this stillness. I'm not an elder, but I do want to call us in with our hearts. So if we could take a moment to just close our eyes, take in a deep breath and exhale and acknowledge all of those that are navigating so much uncertainty. Acknowledge those of us that are navigating spaces, of those of us that we've lost and those that we've lost and we're bringing back home. Acknowledge the hard work that you're doing and acknowledging that today is about honoring the knowledges of all people and empowering each other. So what I'd like to do now is just do a brief introduction of myself. I'm a mixed race Indigenous person. I am from Hollister, North Carolina. I'm enrolled Halawasaponi, descendant Eastern Band Cherokee. I'm so honored to be here with you. I wouldn't be in this space without Paulette Blanchard, who first introduced me to Rising Voices. I'm also an associate professor at the University of Washington, Tacoma, assistant director for the Office of Undergraduate Education, and I'm also the interim director for undergraduate studies in the School of Medicine. So just wanted to say thank you, Pilahuk, again for joining us. And I'm a forever student before we even get to that point. Before we get started into our conversation today, to call all of us to bring in our whole selves to really navigate what it means to empower each other, I'd like to introduce Heather. Heather is one of the pillars of Rising Voices. And so Heather, if you just share an introduction about yourself, that'd be great.
Thank you, Michelle, and good morning, everybody. Afternoon, depending on where you might be. Quite early for some of us, I think, here, and not so early for others. And it's funny having these meetings where we're all, the same time, but different places. So welcome to this pre-event for the Rising Voices 9th annual workshop. My name is Heather Lazarus, and together with Julie Maldonado, we co-direct the Rising Voices Center, the Rising Voices Center for Indigenous and Earth Sciences. It is housed at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, where I work in Boulder, Colorado, on lands that are traditional and contemporary homelands of Arapaho, Ute, and Cheyenne. I also spent time growing up in New Zealand and other places around the world, and I'm happy to have made my way back to my mountains here. A little bit about the Rising Voices Center for Indigenous and Earth Sciences is that we run annual workshops, of which this is a pre-event for our 9th workshop. So we have almost a decade together. Each year, the workshops grow. They have themes that are responsive to what's happening in the world. Our sort of mission is to bring together different ways of knowing, honoring Indigenous knowledges and wisdom and practices equally with earth sciences, with the understanding that by bringing in more understandings from different knowledge systems. Honey, I'm giving a presentation. I have to talk to all these folks. In 2 minutes. And so we do a lot of work to bring different knowledges together with the understanding that that is based on deep relationships. We have, 10 years of introducing people to each other and building those relationships. And it is not quick work. It is hard work. It takes time, respect, honoring each other. And so that is sort of the work that we do, understanding that that foundation underlies any intercultural collaborations towards developing new knowledges and insights for understanding and addressing climate change around the world. And along with sort of building that new knowledge, there are two other pillars for Rising Voices. Another is capacity sharing with communities towards regenerative and sustainable practices. And really also creating space and mentoring opportunities for students, Native students and Indigenous students, and early career folks in the earth sciences. And so the National Center for Atmospheric Research, NCAR, as a Western science institution, is really leading the way in these three pillars through the work of Rising Voices. And we're very grateful for the support that we get to do that. And so I just had wanted to offer that introduction of Rising Voices in the next 3 days. Hopefully you all will be joining us in the workshop. You'll hear a little bit more about this. But we're really thrilled to have Michelle doing this pre-workshop event as well. Thank you so much, Michelle.
You're welcome. Pilahak for having me and for everyone coming together. So what I want to present to you today, and it really is about how are we mindful? Some of the things that I think that is quite troublesome, as a forever student, is this concept that learning and knowledge is not emotional. Everything that we learn and interact, it has a layer of emotions, and learning is also about grief. Grief is not necessarily negative. And I think that we need to really look beyond the settler colonial ways of viewing grief and view it as something a little bit more beyond that. We also know that when we learn and we share knowledge bidirectional, that it's just not from the human world. Knowledge is also, in my belief, and I can only speak for my beliefs, is knowledge is an elder. Knowledge should be viewed as having agency. And so when we talk about knowledge, it's also important to talk about how to be mindful about that. But also, how are we mindful with ourselves about, are we bringing our whole selves to the work that we do? Or are we only bringing portions of it? Are we only bringing the portions that settler colonial systems have said that it's important to do? As an Indigenous person, it's often a very tricky situation when you're in academia to talk about spirituality, or to even bring that context of acknowledging place. And one of the things that I'm seeing is the mindfulness that is so important as we've been navigating a pandemic and so much uncertainty, is that we've had the opportunity to sit with ourselves. Well, I'm hoping most of you have. And so when we think of knowledge and we think of how are we mindful with knowledge, we also have to think about how are we sharing knowledge? And what does that mean to really label something as knowledge? And in my opinion, my beliefs, knowledge is spirit, right? How do we talk about the spirit of knowledge when we're working in community, when we're wearing our multiple hats, and even now sharing space? How do we call each other into a conversation while respecting our lived experiences, our historical traumas, our layers of grief, relearning in this virtual reality? How do we reclaim being emotional? How do we reclaim that knowledge should be viewed as something emotional and it's not negative? We know that as we navigate our world, we're told as we become of age that being emotional is often a sign of weakness. But being emotional, from my culture teachings, it's a sign of being empowered, right? We're learning how to navigate our spaces. We're learning how to grow into our skin. And so how do we decolonize that, right? How do we decolonize waking up every day, acknowledging it's a new day? Waking up every day, asking ourselves, how are we mindful, the ways in which we navigate spaces and communicate knowledge? So what do we do about that? How do we talk about our places, our positions, history of place? But even more, how do we bring in this concept of viewing knowledge with integrity, sharing knowledge with integrity, coming into space with grace and humility? And as brown and Black bodies, the historical realness that we experience, the micro macro aggressions on a daily basis, we don't have the privilege to decide when we can be exposed and not be exposed to micro and macro aggressions. And knowledge is at the root of that. When we really think about the settler colonial historical trauma, when we talk about research, when we talk about what it means to be in team science, who defines the meaning of knowledge, who defines the meaning of good or bad science. So I'm going to go into detail about that in my presentation. So I'm going to just mute you for a
You're muted, Michelle.
So this is just a little bit of information about myself, and I'm going to pass through this. So the whole concept today is, what is the reciprocity of knowledge? And we know that everything comes in full circle. My mentor and a person who I absolutely admire, the reason why I finished my PhD, Dr. Daniel Wildcat, has said that tribal traditional ecological knowledge, TEK holders, acquire their knowledge through intergenerational, through lifetimes of attentiveness, mindfulness to places, living systems, communities. They consider their home for this reason. Citizen science, seen through Indigenous eyes, might be better named as community science. And I know that when we talk about community, we also need to talk about the things that we know are part of our historical traumas. So we know today that we are learning to navigate our heart space, our spirits, when we talk about the recovery of our relatives from residential boarding schools. And there's also awareness about community knowledge about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So my question to you is, when we learn about knowledge, knowledge comes with a very strong responsibility. The question, the ask, comes with the responsibility. And we should always ask ourselves, are we ready for the responsibility of the question? So when we talk about the indigeneity of knowledge, of place-based knowledges, it comes with a lot of history. To understand how to be in our communities, to navigate spaces with us, is also acknowledging what I'm sharing with you right now, the current Native children that are being recovered, and the fact that we have missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is also part of our lived experiences. So once you're aware of this knowledge, and we're talking about climate justice or community science, how do we navigate these spaces? And what does awareness mean? Awareness is also, talking about, how does power and privilege dictate the things that we see, we know, and we learn? So here are two different images from the East Coast. We know that hurricanes are very rampant on the East Coast, and we see the displacements that's happening. Why isn't this information available to everyone? Why is it that certain types of knowledge, it's changed into different types of modality? Well, it's just not accessible, and it should be accessible. What is the justice in actually having data, sharing knowledge, if it's not shared with everyone? So what is the reciprocity of knowledge? Knowledge has an inherent amount of responsibility, and knowledge is only important in the ways in which you share it. So if it's shared in a way that it's equitable to everyone, it's inclusive, and it's diverse, then we're doing something that we're supposed to do, and that's using knowledge to call people into conversation. So what is a community science approach? In many of our community conversations, I would say, to me, if I redefine the word community, it's family. How do I engage my family? And when we work together, we should respect each other as family. So what interdisciplinary research skills and goals are needed to align with the priorities and interests of BIPOC populations for inclusive community science? How do we call people into conversations that are marginalized, underrepresented? And we've seen this very upfront and center with climate justice issues that are happening. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we had the huge bubble of heat. We've seen massive fires. We've seen our relatives in the South dealing with the repercussions and the unjust actions of hurricanes, one after the other. How do we call people into conversation and acknowledge the responsibility of knowledge so that we can empower people, so that we can be inclusive? So what questions are required to include place-based specific relevant research? What questions, if I may say, are required to acknowledge that our knowledges, all the knowledges that you carry, that you acquire, that you share, has an inherent amount of responsibility? And if we're really thinking from a lens of what does justice demand, we should be able to add on to the rest of the statement. So what does justice demand from a community science approach is equity responds to, inclusion ask, justice responds to, and diversity ask. If we cannot fill in the rest of these, these comments here, these statements, then we have a lot of hard work to do. And that's the important part of acknowledging that knowledge has an inherent amount of responsibility. So for many years, through my mentorship with Dr. Wildcat, Dr. Charlotte Cote, extended relationships, up and down the Salish coastline, these are some of the things in which I always talk about and keep front and center when I think about the reciprocity of knowledge. And what does that mean to pull people into conversation? We know that there's a huge amount of traditional knowledge that's often overlooked, and it's only included when people need to include it to say that they're working with communities. And so from a traditional knowledge perspective, the things in which I think are so important when we talk about knowledge and knowledge systems are these three pillars of ethics, knowledge, and practice. What does that mean? Whose values? Responsibility, recognition, and redistribution. Paulette Blanchard, who's with us today, has coined such an eloquent way of really talking about research practices, and that's the 7 R's. And one of the most important components of the 7 R's is that respect, right? The respect of knowledge, that knowledge comes from place and that we learn from place. And so when we think of how a community is interrelated, it's also about wellness. It's also about acknowledging that learning, working together, learning the history of place, really comes with having grace and humility. So how do we bring our whole selves as we're developing these interrelationships, but also acknowledging that these knowledge systems are very diverse, they're interdisciplinary, and that our knowledge also has agency. So Dr. Wildcat also says that, I believe that if I can sit out there long enough, those crows, the trees, and the wind can teach me something about how to be a better human being. I don't call that romanticism, I call that Indigenous realism. And this is not a pan-Indigenous perspective, right? So we all come from different place, we all have different lived experiences, and so that will have different meanings for everyone. And that's the key. Knowledge is not a one size fits all. The ways in which we navigate our relationships with our more than human relatives, with our human relatives, the ways that we navigate our relationships with our elders, the actual knowledge, it's different based on place, base, just the whole concept of coming from a particular place. So myself being from the Southeast, the ways in which I navigate my lived experience and my journey in life are totally immersed in the ways in which I grew up in the Southeast. So what is Indigenous realism? As an eco-critical race theorist, it's really important for me to unpack that. I know that critical race theory at this point in time has been given a huge negative overlay. And critical race theory really is about honoring the voice. What is the conduit of voice? How do we acknowledge the power dynamics that are happening around us? How do we provide platforms so the conduit of voice is uplifted? And through our indigeneity, voice isn't just verbal. And I think that's a huge misconception when we also talk about data. Data just isn't verbal. It could be an artistic expression. It could be music. It could be so many different layers of voices. But when we talk about eco-critical race theory, it's really talking about how do we acknowledge environmental racism? How do we acknowledge that pipelines and other types of mining entities are pretty much mimicking the impact of the railroad, how the railroad came through indigenous lands and created so much human harm, not only just human harm, but more than human harm. So how do we unpack racism to equal, how do we rechange this narrative around what does justice demand? So indigenous cultural autonomy really is about unpacking that there are so many different layers. From a Western context, autonomy is always I, me, my. But when we think of, community science and we think of indigeneity, we have to move beyond the narrative of I, me, my, and really talk about the we. So tribal participatory research, one of the major strategies for tribal participatory research is really unpacking and uplifting sovereignty, how each nation has an inherent right to decide how we want to be empowered and what's best for our people and our more than human relationships. So from an eco-critical race theories perspective, one of the most important things that I think is what I would like for you to take away is that it challenges this anthropocentric view that human beings is the epicenter and that we control and dominate everything. We realized very quickly in this pandemic and all the things that are happening around us today that we are absolutely one of the most fragile organic beings in this web of life. So eco-critical race theory says we must move beyond the decolonized historical analysis. We have to move beyond this and recognize that brown and Black bodies are often at the brunt end of a lot of environmental racism. We can look at Superfund site maps and see that they are in the epicenter of Indigenous communities or bordering brown and Black body communities. We also know that through eco-critical race theory that Indigenous knowledges are interdisciplinary with a collective responsibility. And it goes back to that reciprocity of knowledge. And one of the things that I think that we really need to always keep in the front and center of our mindsets is that, the skepticism about that we're in a post-racial society. Well, we know that's very, not evident, and it's definitely not true. So when we think of environmental racism, we really need to think about how does erasure take place? How can we prevent erasure? And if you've been a part of erasure, how can you find ways to empower people so that you're not continuously erasing silent, marginalized communities? So reciprocity. Reciprocity is all about coming full circle. It responds to community needs. It empowers the communities. It acknowledges the responsibility of knowledge. And it goes back to place-based knowledge systems. In each community, there's a different responsibility. Everyone has their own role, but we work together as units, and we all have different journeys. That's not necessarily saying that our journeys are right or wrong. We just have different journeys. And it comes to the epicenter of the heartbeat of all the work that I do is what does justice demand? What is added value to community science? How do you call people with grace and humility to have a community of science? Who should participate in bidirectional community science? And how should we include BIPOC communities to cohesively participate? What does that look like to have everyone at the table? What does that look like to have all voices heard? The Indigenous Speaker Series, which is something that started out from just the knowledge platform that I wanted to uplift, and then it's definitely from the mentorship that I've had from Dr. Daniel Wildcat, has now morphed into this beautiful partnership with the Sailor Sea Research Institute and my colleague Sierra Green. And I'm showing a picture of my colleague here, Dr. Ryan Emanuel, who's currently a professor at North Carolina State, will be starting a tenured position at Duke University in January. And Ryan does such a beautiful job of calling people into conversation to talk about water. What does that mean to us as woodland people in the Southeast? And the work that he does. How do we uplift people? How do we uplift voices? And how do we fight for the rights of our people to be included in the conversation when we're talking about things like the Atlantic Coast Pipeline? Being from the Southeast, one of the things that's so important to me when we talk about what does justice demand and the reciprocity of knowledge is that we know in the Southeast that we have a major problem with an industrialized agriculture. And with industrialized agriculture also comes with all types of environmental health disparities. So how can we have healthy conversations to bring our whole selves, to be very mindful, to call people into conversation? And so I just wanted to acknowledge Ryan and the work that he does as a member of the Lumbee Nation from North Carolina. So what are the actions? You know, when I think about actions, when I talk about the reciprocity of knowledge, and by any means, I'm not an elder, but I'm a forever student, is how do we decolonize the narrative? You know, why is it that so in so many cases, there are people telling the stories for us through their data, through their publications, through their grants? So decolonize the narrative. Who defines for whom the meaning of diversity and safe science? What is safe? What are the rules of engagement? Who's at the table when we're deciding rules of engagement? And how are these bidirectional safe spaces for researchers and community partners to bring their whole selves? How do we bring our whole selves to these sorts of conversations or ways of developing partnerships? And how do we create professional development workshops on history of place? One of the things that's so important, again, it's not a one size fits all way in which you work in community. And it's important to unpack that a little bit more. So we have discussion questions that we're going to have today. We're going to break out into groups. These discussion questions will be put up again. And so we have facilitators, Haku and Stephanie, who's going to be with us today. We'll have representatives from Rising Voices, Heather and Julie, who will be coming in and out of our conversations. But the three questions that we're going to unpack today is explain what has or has not been accomplished to incorporate BIPOC place-based needs that are grounded in interdisciplinary knowledges. Describe your research needs and support for successful place-based community science opportunities, and explain how your research or the work that you do, the teaching, the nonprofit organizations, all the multiple hats that you may wear, incorporate community science. And so these are just some references of work in which I pull from. And I just want to say Pilahuk Wado for sitting with patience, opening your hearts to listening to what I would like to share today about the responsibility of knowledge, the responsibility of the ask. I also want to acknowledge the Indigenous Peoples Climate Change Working Group and the Indigenous speakers